there are certain social factors at work that I guess influence abuse enabling. They certainly have in the past decades. It's true that research on child abuse only started off in 1968, and this also coincides with the start, I guess, of the sexual revolution, liberalism, feminism, and so forth. And as such, there's a big confound. To what extent did they benefit, and to what extent did they hamper an understanding of abuse and abuse enabling specifically? I can go into great detail about this, and I will. I will specifically go into great detail about feminism because not many people know that, for example, the woman who started the first domestic abuse shelter in the UK was harassed by feminists. In fact, they ended up killing her dog and forcing her to flee from the UK. I will be discussing, because of this and other examples and other situations that in which feminists have acted against, I guess, the fight against abuse. I will be going into them in greater detail. But essentially, what I want to focus on for this particular video is how abuse enabling has been influenced by Western culture and how, I guess, it's been enabled by this culture. So to start off, to give a rigorous definition of abuse enabling, the most important aspect of it is that the abuse enabler supports the abuser in general terms by providing love, support, companionship, all the while ignoring that the abuse is taking place either against the enabler themselves or against a third party, like for example the enabler's children, if we're talking about domestic abuse, as I'm talking about mostly in these videos, or by pretending and trying to get everyone around him or her, around the enabler, to pretend that the abuse is not happening, or by downplaying it, by pretending it's not very serious, or that it's not necessarily a bad thing, that it's being done for one's own good, for example. I'm just, it's in a sense disturbing to talk about this. Another aspect is that of refusing to help the victim, ignoring the victim's cries for help, pretending that the victim isn't suffering, or explaining away the victim's suffering in some way. And a third aspect is actually joining into the abuse, taking the abuser's side against the victim, and not just being willing to, for example, lie about the abuser, covering up for the abuser, but also join the abuser in the abuse itself, helping the abuser carry out their abuse. It's, while importantly not being an active participant, I guess, in a direct participant rather, in this abuse, and not primarily driving the abuser to carry out the abuse. Now, it's certainly the case that my mother did on a few occasions, well, more than a few occasions, encourage my father to inflict various kinds of verbal abuse on me, to ridicule me, shame me, etc. Damn it. Apologies again. But lost my train of thought, but as I was saying, not only was my mother did, I guess, ask him to inflict various kinds of abuse on me, but more than a few times, as a means, I would argue, to gain control of me, because she probably, I guess, felt that I wasn't doing what was appropriate. I'll get into that in a later video, but essentially, yeah, these are the main aspects of abuse enabling. Pretending that the abuse isn't happening, covering up for the abuser, taking part in the abuse itself, and denying any sort of efforts, or indeed stifling any efforts on the victim's part to seek help for the abuse, but not actively engaging as a primary abuser in the abuse, not being the one to typically instigate it and carry it out, I guess. So, bearing these things in mind, I have to say that the Western culture has encouraged abuse enabling to a great degree in the last 50 years, since the civil rights movement, sexual revolution, liberalism overall took off. And there's a reason for that. It's because, you know, as these various liberal left-wing movements campaign for tolerance, their message overall was one of pacifism, of accepting differences, of not confronting people violently or striving to destroy them, but trying to come together with and settling each other's differences. That's what it was superficially about. Now, of course, when we look at movements such as feminism, we know there was a lot of corruption involved into it and a lot of supremacism. I know there are plenty of people who talk about this in various men's rights channels, and as I mentioned, you know, Erin Pizzi and a lot of people who talk about domestic violence have been harassed by feminists because they exposed the fact that quite a few women, that about half of domestic violence perpetrators were women, and these people, yeah, they were harassed, and and by, I guess, by eliminating any sort of discourse on you know, female involvement in abuse, by presenting media, for example films, that depicted women who are being abused by men as innocent victims, entirely defenseless against the brute and tyrant. By depicting them like this, they unfortunately not only didn't expose domestic abuse and abuse in general against men, but they also created the impression that abuse victims are all innocent and pure, and that all they really want is for people to rescue them. And the reality is a bit more complex than that. So the first way in which liberalism, I guess, overall encourage people to take a positive view, and I say that not in a pleasant sense, of abuse enabling, is the idea that really being gentle and always looking for peace makes you a good person. Now that's not necessarily true. You know, you can have people who strive for peace, but at the same time realize that when the time comes for war, when the time comes to actually defend people, they have to stand up and fight. But there are also people who think that standing up and fighting is inherently bad, and these people believe that if they were just nice enough to everyone around them, and if they provided education to everyone around them, if they tried to influence the culture in order to influence individuals, they would actually succeed at removing the abusive aspects of an abuser's character from them. Now, this is abuse enabling, is pretty much a recipe for it. Anyone who thinks that abusers can be taught to stop, just, well, certainly anyone who thinks that narcissists, psychopaths, etc. can be just taught to stop, can be discouraged from it through, I guess, a positive form of education, that is to say, an form of education that is pleasant for everyone, that's not coercive, that's not aggressive or hostile towards them. Anyone who thinks this sort of thing can work just doesn't know abuse. Simple as that. They don't realize that the reason an abuser is being abusive is not because there was some deep-seated suffering or low self-esteem or anything like that, as liberally inclined anti-bullying advocates claim. It's because the abuser likes to cause suffering and takes pleasure in humiliating others and gaining a sense of power from it. That's really what it is about. And if you are nice to the abuser will just exploit you for that. If you try to campaign in favor of being gentle towards the abuser, of trying to understand the abuser and trying to find some common ground and tolerance, the abusers will enjoy that because it gives them free rein to actually carry out abuse. And moreover, it gives them free rein to blame the victim, because what happens is, if someone abuses you, you are pissed off, ideally. And that means you want to beat the crap out of that person and just wipe the floor with them. Which is very healthy, I have to say. But if you're in an environment in which violence is condemned at all times, then if you want to violently retaliate against the abuser, if you say want to put them in prison, or you want to put them in a position that they get a death penalty, I'm just giving legal examples, not illegal ones, like, you know, wanting to shoot the person in cold blood, then pacifists are going to wag their collective finger at you and say that what you're doing is wrong. You should try to tolerate, you should try to come to sort of understanding with the abusers so that everyone is happy. Well, this cannot happen. It simply cannot happen. Abusers don't want it to happen. If, honestly, anyone who wants to get along with others can do so. It's easy. And anyone who wants to, I guess, build positive relationships with others can do so, provided that one finds people who aren't abusive, aren't abuse enablers. It's easy. But they don't want that, because they want to have all the attention, all the resources, they want to have all the power, they want to deprive other people of everything. And it's not because they've been disenfranchised or some other sob story that liberals like to tell. It's because they're scumbags. So liberalism, as I said, has encouraged bullying by trying to get everyone to sympathize with bullies as well as with victims, and that doesn't work. It simply doesn't. What's worse is that liberals have always campaigned on well, this has to do with the fact with abuse as opposed to abuse enabling. They've always campaigned on issues like, you know, sexual orientation, being bullied for that sort of thing, for being gay. Well, I have to say, if what they're doing basically when they advocate for tolerance towards gay people and the defense for gay people, I guess, is what they're advocating for, instead of targeting the abuser, the reinforcing one particular victim, all they're doing is encouraging the abuser to go to another victim. one that's not protected by gay rights or any sort of special interest group. So really, this idea of focusing on preventing trouble between the bully and the potential victim, rather than taking action against the bully themselves, against the abuser in general, I have to say that's a form of very mild, I guess, abuse enabling itself. So that's one issue about liberalism, but there's also feminism, as I said, with its tendency in the media to portray these weak, helpless, innocent female victims of big, violent men. Now, there are two issues with this. First of all, abuse can often be psychological, and a lot of psychological abuse is inflicted by women because that's their ideal means of inflicting abuse, since they're not that physically strong. But another issue is that there are certain women, and certainly my mother is one of them, and there are certain people actually in general whom I guess have traits that are characteristic of borderline personality disorder. That's borderline personality disorder, and are very waif-like, as it's been described, as in they're weak, they're helpless, but at the same time their weakness and helplessness is not based on circumstance so much as psychology, and these people tend to look for strong, dominant characters to which they latch onto, and they don't really care whether or not that particular person they latch onto is abusive. In fact, if they see that person is being abusive towards potential threats to her, she sees this as a good thing, since it means he can protect her, but she doesn't actually consider that this guy could be an abuser. So this sort of person that feminists have talked about, the weak, defenseless victim that needs everyone else's help, well, the problem is that there are weak, defenseless victims that actually get into this sort of situation, sort of abusive situation, and enable it. And that's not to say that we should, relieve the perpetrator of all responsibility. But I do feel that what feminism has done is convince a lot of people, and I have to say subconsciously, perhaps myself included, for a period of time, that female victims should have all responsibility for their victimization waived. And again, considering the responsibility of the victim in their abuse is not at all the same thing as waiving the abuser's responsibility for the abuse. The abuser's responsibility is enormous, and certainly this sort of person needs to be brought to justice. But importantly, the victim also has responsibility to take a stance against the abuser if this sort of thing is not physically possible at a particular time, then to try to find a way to make it possible in the future, and to also stand up for whatever other victims of abuse exist. I have to say, incidentally, I work in I work in an institution that fosters workplace bullying, as I've unfortunately found out halfway through my contract there, if I can call it that. And for me, it's been a nightmare. Just most of what I've done was honestly stalling any sort of definitive work with these people, because I couldn't bear for me to do anything to benefit them, even if it meant a great loss for me. And I'm still struggling with that, to be honest. But for me, the idea of tolerating them, or putting up with them, that's of sparing them any sort of responsibility and sparing any sort of intent to how should I say this, condemn them for what they're doing, condemn as in take any sort of concrete measures against them. I haven't given up on that at all. And in fact, I will be making a series of videos on workplace bullying in the future, and I hope this will be very informative for everyone. But I do imagine that over several years people can give in to this sort of people and concede to helping horrible people, especially if they've been raised that way. But one thing that doesn't get such people, such abuse enablers, out of their state is the sort of collusion that feminism has given them, that's completely waiving them of all responsibility. Indeed, it's taking a sense of, it's developing a sense of responsibility, developing a sense of duty to correct yourself and to take action against the abuser. That is really the way out of enabling abuse. So I would argue that feminism has not only helped provide a cover for abuse enablers, but also encourage them to be abuse enablers by always telling them it's not their fault. Well, it certainly isn't that for them being abused, but to an extent it is their fault for staying with the abuser, and it is something that they have to correct. Not something they have to be abused for, of course, and then they have to be beaten for, but it's something that they have to be strongly encouraged to change, and if they actually are willing to listen. And the issue with feminism is that it's been very, very militant. So if you wanted to talk about abuse enabling in scientific journals, for example, in sociological journals or psychological journals, soft science journals, that is, you would have heard from them complaining about how you're focusing too much on, the abuse enabler, not enough on the actual abuser, which isn't the case. I have seen papers, I've seen more papers talking about, not that many, but I've seen a few papers talking about how the abuse enabler was being criticized too harshly compared to the abuser, and I've only seen one paper, admittedly I haven't looked very thoroughly, talking about abuse enabling specifically, as well as one book that I've come across, even though there are lots and lots of books on abuse in general. So, but at the same time, if you wanted to talk about it in your, I guess, social life, this certainly has been the case for me. You would be criticized for being too harsh on this person when all this drives you is to continue supplicating to her and or to him and to this person's desire for trouble to be avoided, which is usually what drives on abuse enabling, cowardice, that is. And to wrap this up about liberalism and feminism, and this was again quite painful for me in a sense, quite troubling. On campuses, for example, when a kid in the UK, for example, people, as I understand it, tend to stay at local schools up until their A-levels, up until they graduate with their A-levels, up until they graduate high school, that is, or college rather, I think the term is in the UK. When they go, up until they go to university, they stay with their parents. Once they go to university, they tend to move around. I know for a fact that one woman whom I know actually went to a university halfway across the country, even though she was offered a place at UCL because she lived in London and she didn't want to live with her abusive parents anymore. So people do go to universities and away from their homes, and once away from their homes they're exposed to a completely new environment where they can actually help recover from the abuse. But they've got certain campaigning groups at each university, and unfortunately all these campaigning groups are associated with the far left. And I made a horrible mistake of, I guess, trying to encourage these people to see how abusive personalities, those of politicians, for example, those of various CEOs, those of various people working in HR and so forth, and of communities of such abusive people, and of their sniveling sycophants and supporters, how these particular people with these particular mindsets were the source of all the problems they were campaigning against, and B, trying to help them because I saw them as being, I guess, small group of people frantically trying to pursue justice, which was very much what I have been meaning to do for a long period of time. I sided with them, and I found to my great discomfort that they were the sorts of people who enable abuse, particularly if it's abused by minorities and by women, and yeah, I said minorities, homosexuals, and basically the sort of special interest groups they stick up for. And if a lot of them being pacifists, if you talk to them about abuse enabling, how bad it is, if you want them to actually take a stance against abusers, they're not going to do that. So you are finally going to a completely new place with new people who might potentially be willing to stand up for victims, because they always talk about standing up for victims, and you find out that they just don't care. They only stand up for certain victims. Actually, in a lot of cases, these people are victims. For example, people in Syria or in Palestine who are suffering from military occupation or tyranny. So not only are they standing up to the victims, but they're also standing up for the victims, but also standing up for the perpetrators when these perpetrators are of the appropriate minorities, or if they're women and so forth. So I just, if you've been an abuse victim, you find a lot of hypocrisy out there as you try to join groups that supposedly campaign against abuse in specific ways. They're not campaigning against abuse in general. They don't care about that. In fact, they're perfectly willing to side with perpetrators who fit their particular profile, I guess. And that stifles. It really, I would argue, stifles support for people who genuinely want to campaign on these issues. In fact, I know that there was one gay bastard who was chair of a committee where I actually went because it was supposed to be the committee that would handle student welfare issues at my university, and I talked to that committee about potentially setting up a campaign for raising awareness of abuse, psychological abuse not being well known about, and people, I guess, not knowing about the scale of the problem and not being able to spot people who are psychopaths, for example. And I thought, and I told these guys about it, about getting materials and just flyering, and the response I got from this, sorry, I was gonna say a very offensive word, from this gay person who is, would have gotten the shit beaten out of him 30 or 40 years ago by random people who just got a kick out of abuse. If it wasn't for all the campaigning done for him, he just said maybe we don't like talking to abuse victims. And incidentally, this guy later got an award from the vice chancellor because all of his campaigns were about supporting the various institutions in the union which which got its funding from the university, so it was a matter of him kissing up to people. And basically, this sort of people who, want other people to stick up for them, but aren't actually willing to do justice themselves, I would say they've infiltrated a lot of campaigning. As I said, feminism did infiltrate domestic violence campaigning and support. Likewise, I've noticed how gay rights groups have infiltrated bullying campaigns. All these people who don't care about anyone apart from themselves and their own cliques, I guess, of their own minorities, irrespective of the moral quality of individual people within these minorities, they really can stifle any sort of effort for people to, I guess, work to expose the matter of abuse enabling and abuse in general, and in doing so become abuse enablers themselves. And these are all the ways, well, some of them I hope, I hope most of them, that I've outlined most of them, in which liberals and feminists, etc., actually enable abuse and encourage tolerance towards abuse enabling in our culture. I'm sorry if it's been a bit of a rant, and I'm actually going to continue it. I have to say one last thing. It's not there has been, certainly in the last 50 years, the development of a culture of tolerance, and I use that word in a neutral sense. I don't actually mean tolerance is a good thing necessarily, and of non-violence. Maybe there have been campaigns, for example, against domestic violence, against one's children, etc. And I think that ultimately missed the point, and it encouraged a lot of cowardice, really. A lot, I keep hearing people say that it's okay to do anything as long as what you do doesn't go against anyone else. That's typical liberal stance. I guess it's also a prominent part of our culture, but more importantly, it's a stance that's taken by cowards a lot. I think cowardice really is a major problem in Western society, maybe in any society really, and I don't honestly believe it's something that can be fixed. You can certainly give people incentive not to be cowardly and to stand up for victims, but ultimately, if the drive for self-preservation, if people fundamentally uphold that drive above the victim's suffering, then you're not going to be able to provide them with incentives. Their mind will just shut down and go into self-preservation mode as soon as they sense that there might be trouble for themselves if they actually stand up for the victim. That's how, I guess, such people work. That's how I've seen them work, certainly. And this idea of minding your own business, of not getting into any trouble, of live and let live, this sort of thing, all this cowardice is itself a form of abuse enabling, and it's a very, very prevalent one. And what's more, since it's so prevalent, you can always find people who actually want to silence those who call them, those who call cowardice, to talk about cowardice and talk about it openly and describe it for what it is. They will feel personally offended, even though you're not necessarily talking about them, and they will want people not to talk about cowardice anymore. So they will, join the ranks of liberals, in not so much in the sense of being activists, but they will certainly support liberalism. They will support the idea of enshrined liberalism, not because they believe in universal love, but because they're cowards and they don't want to have any sort of responsibility and any sort of accountability for all their non-actions, well, inaction, and for all their efforts to withdraw from situations of abuse because they don't want to have anything to do with it, as long as they're not the ones being victimized. I really believe that this is one of the major forms of abuse enabling out there, and certainly anyone who's been abused can remember people who didn't want to get involved when the abuse victim did come and try to talk to them and get them involved. They will remember people who looked the other way, and while it may not be as serious as any abuse enabler who's been in their lives since birth, for example, or for many years, cowardly bystanders are still a major problem and still they're a major aspect of abuse enabling. Well, that's all I have to say, and I hope it's been informative. I do know that some of the statements I've made were quite provocative, especially about feminism. Naturally, there are going to be some people who will hate me for them. But I certainly welcome discussion about this, and any questions you've got, any sort of request for clarification, I'll be perfectly happy to answer them. So thanks for watching, and see you next time when I will be discussing my own mother's abusive behavior in greater detail, and probably with far less eloquence than I've shown in this video.